Did you know that according to mainstream history, the ancient and medieval worlds were places of limited tools, limited knowledge, and limited reach? That our ancestors, however creative, however brave, were fundamentally working in the dark, groping toward the civilization we now take for granted? That the sophistication we associate with the modern age, precision engineering, nanotechnology, intercontinental artistic exchange, belongs to us and not to them, but scattered across the museums of Europe, locked in glass cases and archive rooms and the quiet corners of archaeological collections, are objects that refuse to accept that story. Artifacts made by human hands in eras that should not have been capable of making them. Too refined, too precise, too impossibly accomplished for the time and place they came from. These are 5 artifacts that don't just impress us. They terrify us with what they imply about the people who made them. First, the Portland Vase. In the year 1582, a sealed marble sarcophagus was unearthed somewhere on the outskirts of Rome. Inside, among the bones and burial offerings, rested a small glass vessel, unlike anything scholars had ever encountered. It stood just under 10 inches tall. Its body was midnight blue, almost black, the deep color of a sky just before dawn, but layered over that darkness was a shell of pure white glass. And into that white layer, some unknown artist had carved a series of figures with the precision and delicacy of a master sculptor working in ivory. The figures moved across the surface in a continuous scene. Gods, mortals, a woman reclining beneath a tree, a young man approaching with outstretched arms, serpents and anchors and symbols whose meaning has been argued over for 4 centuries, without resolution. Every figure had depth, shadow, texture, drapery folded, hair curled, eyes seemed to look back at the viewer. This was the Portland Vase, and its existence poses a question that 2 millennia of civilization have not been able to fully answer. How did they make it? The technique is called cameo glass. It requires a glass blower to create an inner vessel of dark glass, then coat it in a second, contrasting layer of white glass, while both are still molten enough to fuse but not so hot that they merge entirely. The outer layer must be perfectly even. Then once cooled, an engraver must carve through the white layer with a tool so controlled, so sensitive to pressure, that a single misplaced stroke would ruin months of work. There is no room for error. There is no way to undo a cut. Modern glassmakers have attempted to reproduce the Portland Vase. These are professional artists with centuries of accumulated technique available to them, with modern tools and controlled environments, and the benefit of knowing exactly what the finished product is supposed to look like. Most have failed. Those who have come closest have freely admitted that their versions are inferior, that the original possesses a quality they cannot replicate. The vase passed through the hands of Roman emperors, Renaissance collectors, and English aristocrats, before eventually being purchased by the British Museum in 1945. But its journey through history was not peaceful. In February 1845, a young man named William Lloyd walked into the museum, picked up a large basalt sculpture nearby, and smashed it through the case containing the Portland Vase. The vase shattered into over 200 pieces. What happened next is almost as remarkable as the vase itself. A craftsman named John Doubleday spent months reassembling the fragments, using nothing but his eyes and a set of tiny fragments to reconstruct one of the most complex glass objects ever made. He succeeded. He left out 37 small pieces that he could not place with confidence. Further restoration work managed to incorporate most of those remaining fragments. The vase today stands in the museum's room 70, restored to something close to its original form. But it carries the scars of its destruction, and perhaps that is fitting, because the Portland Vase has always existed in a state of fragile impossibility. Something this refined, this technically demanding, this achingly beautiful, should not have come from a world without modern instruments, without chemistry labs, without precision machinery. And yet it did. No one knows who made it. No one knows precisely when. No one knows what the figures on its surface are meant to depict. Those scholars have proposed everything from the myth of Peleus and Thetis to the story of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Every theory has supporters. Every theory has holes. What we know for certain is this. Somewhere in the ancient world, a human being sat down with molten glass and a carving tool and produced something that makes modern craftspeople feel humble. That is not a comfortable fact. It suggests that the ancient world contained levels of artisanal knowledge and aesthetic ambition that we have barely begun to account for. Second, the Lycurgus Cup. There is a cup sitting in the British Museum that changes color. Not metaphorically, not as a trick of the lighting, in direct light. It appears jade green, almost opaque. Hold a light source inside it or behind it, and it transforms entirely, glowing a deep, rich blood red, like wine held up to a candle flame. It is the same object, same glass, same thickness. The color change is real, and for most of human history, no one could explain it. The Lycurgus Cup was made in Rome in the 4th century AD. It depicts a scene from Greek mythology, the punishment of King Lycurgus, who was driven mad by the god Dionysus and became entangled in a grapevine that eventually swallowed him. The figures are carved in extraordinary detail, using the same cameo technique seen in the Portland Vase, relief figures emerging from the glass surface in 3 dimensions. The cup was clearly made for someone wealthy, someone powerful. It is a showpiece, an object of spectacle, and the spectacle it provided was almost certainly deliberate. Imagine a Roman banquet. The cup sits on a table, green and gleaming in the torchlight of the room. A servant lifts a lamp behind it, or places it near the fire, and suddenly, in front of the assembled guests, the cup bleeds red, gasps, whispers, the theater of power. The owner of such a cup was clearly in possession of something magical, something inexplicable, something that separated them from ordinary people. For over 15 centuries, that inexplicability held. Historians admired the cup. Craftsmen tried to copy its color-shifting property. Nobody could, then. In 1990, researchers at the British Museum subjected the cup's glass to electron microscopy and found the answer. Hidden inside the glass, dispersed so evenly that they are invisible to the naked eye, were nanoparticles. Tiny fragments of metal, gold, and silver alloyed together, each particle measuring between 50 and 100 nanometers across. These particles were so small that they interact with light at the quantum level. When light hits them from outside, it scatters in a way that produces green. When light passes through them from behind, it is absorbed and re-emitted as red. This is nanotechnology, the deliberate manipulation of matter at the nanometer scale to produce specific optical effects. It is a field that modern science only began formally developing in the 1980s. Roman craftsmen were doing it in the 4th century AD. The obvious question is whether this was accidental. Perhaps the gold and silver contamination entered the glass by chance. Perhaps the Roman glassmakers stumbled onto this effect without understanding the physics behind it. That is the conventional reassurance, and it may well be true. But here is what that reassurance does not address. Someone noticed. Someone saw that this glass changed color. Someone decided that was exactly what they wanted. The cup was not discarded as defective. It was finished with extraordinary care, given elaborate carved figures, and presented as a masterpiece. Whether or not the Roman craftsmen understood the nanoscience, they understood the result, and they pursued it with deliberate intention. Furthermore, analysis of other Roman glassware has since revealed that the use of nanoparticles was not a single accident. Similar effects appear in fragments of Roman glass from across the empire. It was a technique, however imperfectly understood. It was knowledge that was then lost entirely for over 1,000 years. No medieval glassmaker reproduced it. No Renaissance craftsman stumbled back onto it. The secret of the color-changing glass vanished so completely that when modern scientists finally cracked it in 1990, they were not rediscovering something forgotten. They were discovering it for what felt like the first time. What else did the ancient world know that has simply ceased to exist? Third, the Ardagh Chalice. In the late summer of 1868, a boy named Paddy Flanagan was digging for potatoes in a field in Ardagh, a small village in County Limerick, Ireland. His shovel struck something solid a few inches below the surface. He reached in and pulled out a large silver cup. Beside it, buried together as if hidden in haste, were 4 brooches and a smaller bronze cup. He had no way of knowing what he had found. He sold the collection to the local bishop for a modest sum. What Paddy Flanagan had pulled from that Irish field was one of the most extraordinary objects in all of early medieval metalwork, and one of the great mysteries of a period in European history that mainstream scholarship still struggles to fully understand. The Ardagh Chalice is a communion cup, almost certainly made for use in a Christian ceremony. It stands about 7 inches tall on a broad conical foot, and its body is a perfect hemisphere of polished silver. But the simplicity ends there. Every surface that can be decorated is decorated. The lower body is encircled by a broad band of interlaced bronze and gold wire, worked into geometric patterns of such intricacy that a magnifying glass reveals detail invisible to the naked eye. Panels of filigree gold, each one a miniature world of spirals and knots and zoomorphic shapes. Studs of amber, blue, and red glass enamel, names of the apostles picked out in fine letters around the cup's rim, and all of it executed with a precision that has left modern jewelers speechless. Ireland in the 7th and 8th centuries, when the chalice is believed to have been made, was not a center of technological sophistication in the way that Rome had been. It was a land of monastic communities, cattle farming, seasonal rainfall, and deep spiritual practice. Its craftsmen did not have access to glass-blowing furnaces, sophisticated alloy chemistry, or precision engineering instruments. And yet the Ardagh Chalice contains 154 separate components, joined and fitted together with tolerances that modern craftsmen have described as astonishing. The filigree alone, the gold wire work visible on the decorative panels, requires wire to be drawn to a consistent thickness of less than a millimeter, and then manipulated into intricate patterns and soldered in place without any visible joint. This is work done without microscopes, without precision wire gauges, without temperature-controlled soldering equipment. How a craftsman working in a monastic workshop in early medieval Ireland achieved this level of consistency is genuinely unclear. There's something else about the chalice that unsettles scholars. When it was buried with care. The objects were arranged together, the chalice inverted over the brooches as if to protect them. This was not burial in a graveyard or a pagan ritual site. This was concealment. Someone hid these objects deliberately, probably quickly, and never came back for them. The period in question, somewhere between the late 7th and early 9th centuries, was a time of Viking raids along the Irish coast. Monasteries were a favorite target. Monks with minutes to spare before a longship crew arrived at their gate would have grabbed what was most precious and buried it as deep and as fast as they could. Someone buried the Ardagh Chalice to save it. They died or fled before they could return, and so it sat under an Irish potato field for roughly 1,000 years, until a boy's shovel found it on an autumn afternoon. It is now in the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin, and visitors who stand before its case consistently report the same reaction: disbelief that something made 14 centuries ago, in an island at the edge of Europe, could look like this. Not primitive, not rough, not a step along the road toward refinement, complete, as though the craftsman who made it had already arrived somewhere that the rest of us are still trying to reach. Fourth, the Alfred Jewel. In 1693, a farm worker ploughing a field near North Petherton in Somerset, England, turned up a small golden object, barely 2.5 inches long. He might have pocketed it and forgotten it, or sold it for whatever gold was worth that week. Instead, word spread, and the object eventually made its way into the collection of a gentleman scholar who recognized that it was something unusual. That instinct was correct. What the farm worker had found was the Alfred Jewel, and it belongs to a very small category of artifacts. Objects whose creation raises questions that our picture of history cannot comfortably answer. The jewel is a teardrop-shaped piece of quartz crystal set in a gold casing, worked into the shape of a stylized fish or animal, with a boar's head collar at one end and a hollow socket at the other. That socket almost certainly held a thin rod of ivory or wood, suggesting the jewel was the handle of a pointer used to follow lines of text while reading. The crystal is clear and polished to optical quality. Set beneath it, visible through the stone, is an enamel figure, a person rendered in bright blue and green and white, seated, holding what appear to be 2 flowering rods or scepters. In Old English letters no larger than 2 millimeters in height, runs an inscription: Aelfred mec het gewerken. Alfred ordered me made. If that Alfred is King Alfred the Great of Wessex, who died in 899 AD, then this object was personally commissioned by one of the most significant rulers in early English history. A king who drove the Vikings back from much of England. A king who established a legal code, reformed education, and translated Latin texts into Old English so that ordinary people could read them. A king who, according to historical record, distributed decorated pointers called aestles to monasteries across his kingdom as gifts accompanying copies of his translated works. The jewel fits that description almost perfectly, but what troubles scholars is not the inscription or the history, it is the craftsmanship. The enamel figure beneath the crystal is painted in a technique called cloisonné, where thin gold wires are laid onto a surface to create compartments, each one then filled with glass paste in a specific color and fired. This technique exists across many medieval cultures, but the figure in the Alfred Jewel is painted in a style that does not match any comparable work from 9th century England. The colors, the composition, the rendering of the face and drapery. It looks like something from the Byzantine world, from Constantinople, from workshops 1,000 miles away from Somerset. Did Alfred import craftsmen from the Byzantine court? Did he obtain the enamel panel from an Eastern source and have an English goldsmith build the gold casing around it? Was there an exchange of artistic knowledge between Alfred's Wessex and the great empire of the East that historians have failed to adequately document? Nobody knows. The Alfred Jewel sits in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and is considered one of the finest surviving objects from Anglo-Saxon England. It is also, by almost any measure, finer than it should be. More technically accomplished than anything else known from that time and place. A piece of work so sophisticated that it requires a level of craftsmanship that the historical record of 9th century England cannot fully account for. One small object, 2.5 inches of gold and crystal and colored glass. And inside it, a question that centuries of scholarship have circled without ever quite answering. Who really made this? And what else did they know how to do? Fifth, the Sutton Hoo helmet. In the summer of 1939, an archaeologist named Basil Brown was excavating a series of burial mounds at Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, England. Burial mounds were not unusual in the English countryside. Most contained only scattered fragments, disturbed by centuries of weathering and human interference. But the largest mound, at Sutton Hoo, a gently rising hill in a field overlooking the River Deben, had never been opened. Brown dug carefully. What he found beneath the surface was the ghost of a ship, the dark stains of rotted timber still visible in the soil, preserving the outline of a vessel over 27 meters long. Inside the burial chamber at the ship's center, he found treasure. Gold belt buckles, silver bowls, a 6-stringed lyre, drinking horns with silver mounts, a full set of iron chainmail, coins from Frankish mints, and wrapped in a rusted cluster of corroded iron fragments, the pieces of a helmet. The fragments were painstaking to recover. They came apart in the excavator's hands, but even in their corroded state, Brown could see enough to understand that this was not an ordinary helmet. This was the face of a king. Over the following decades, the helmet fragments were studied, conserved, and eventually reconstructed. What emerged from that work, through 2 attempts at reconstruction and decades of scholarly analysis, was one of the most iconic objects in all of British archaeology. A full iron helmet with a mask that covers the entire face, eyebrows of bronze inlaid with silver wire and garnets, a nosepiece that flows into a mustache of tinned wire, cheek guards that frame a molded face of extraordinary severity. The surface of the helmet is covered in stamped bronze foil panels, showing warriors on horseback, dancing figures, and interlocking animal shapes of such density and intricacy that hours of looking reveal new details. The helmet dates to the early 7th century. The burial is almost certainly that of Raedwald, king of East Anglia, who died around 624 AD. What disturbs scholars about the Sutton Hoo helmet is not simply its beauty or its complexity, though both are remarkable. It is what the helmet implies about a world that the surviving historical record tells us almost nothing about. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of the early 7th century are among the most poorly documented societies in English history. There are a handful of chronicles, a collection of poems, some saints' lives. The picture they paint is fragmentary, violent, and barely literate. Warlords fighting over muddy strips of farmland. Culture in the simplest possible form. And then there is this helmet. The craftsmanship draws on traditions from Sweden, from the late Roman world, from Byzantine metalwork, and from something distinctly and brilliantly local that has no exact parallel anywhere else. The garnet cloisonné work in the eyebrows, tiny red stones set in gold cells smaller than a grain of rice, is technically equivalent to the finest jewelry from any civilization on Earth at that moment in history. The composite construction of the helmet, iron plate and chainmail and applied bronze foil and tinned wire, all working together in a single object, demonstrates engineering knowledge that is genuinely sophisticated. But there is no school that taught this, no written manual, no guild records, no surviving workshop. The knowledge that produced the Sutton Hoo helmet existed in the hands and minds of craftsmen who left no other trace in the historical record. It suggests that the world of early medieval England was far richer, far more connected to international artistic traditions, and far more technically accomplished than the history books have typically credited. That somewhere in 7th century East Anglia, there were workshops doing work of a quality that should not, according to our usual picture of the Dark Ages, have been possible. The helmet is now in the British Museum, displayed in room 41. A replica stands in the nearby town of Woodbridge. When visitors first see it, the reaction is almost always the same: silence. These 5 objects share something beyond their beauty and their mystery. Each one arrived in the historical record as if dropped there by mistake. Too refined for its time. Too accomplished for its place. Too perfect for the tools and knowledge we have assigned to the people who made them. The Portland Vase speaks of glassmakers who mastered a technique that modern craftspeople still struggle to replicate. The Lycurgus Cup contains nanotechnology that modern science only formally understood in the 1990s. The Ardagh Chalice was produced in early medieval Ireland with a precision that leaves contemporary jewelers baffled. The Alfred jewel carries knowledge from the Byzantine world into a Somerset field with no explanation for how it got there. And the Sutton Hoo helmet was built in a Dark Age workshop that, according to history, should not have existed at all. Maybe the lesson in all of this is simpler than we want it to be. Maybe the people who came before us were not lesser, not cruder, not stumbling in the dark toward the enlightenment we imagine we represent. Maybe they were simply different, possessed of skills and sensitivities and forms of knowledge that did not survive in writing, only in the objects they left behind. Objects that 2,000 years later still make us feel very small.